Okay, let's get started, ladies and gents. It's good to see all of you. Good day, America, and all of our ships at sea. Welcome to the Madison Grand Strategy First Wednesday Sea Power Workshop. Today is January 7th, 2026. I'm your host, Paul Giara. Today's guest is Dave Ochmanek, an old friend and eminent RAND defense analyst whose specialty, if I can say it this way, but certainly not limited to this, is force planning. We'll ask for Dave's take on all of this in a moment, and I draw your attention to the remarkable resources, reports, and interviews available to track Dave's thinking. They're listed in your invitations and will be included as references when this video is posted by the Naval Institute. Before I take a moment to introduce Dave, there's something on my mind that I want to share very briefly. In numerous conversations, my colleagues and I have speculated on and bemoaned the lack of presidential support for the Navy. The famous account of President Ronald Reagan declaring in a cabinet meeting his support for John Layman's 600-ship Navy and interrupting Jeane Kirkpatrick to do so is legend. Since then, effective and consequential presidential buy-in has been definitely lacking. I thought of myself in this regard like a dog chasing a truck, with no idea what I would do with it if I actually caught the truck of presidential support for the Navy. Well, guess what? If I can extend this tortured analogy, we seem to have caught the truck, or at least the Navy has caught the president's attention. Okay, you might like the way he said it, you might like what he said, or conversely, not. But it's up to us to work with his imprimatur, build momentum, make plans, and make those plans work. Let's get to work. Now to introduce Dave Ochmanek. Dave's focus on force planning looms large because the Earth is shifting beneath our national security-minded feet at an obvious time of profound change. Given the renewal of great power competition, the aggressive rise of China, dramatic impending changes on battlefields from Iran to Gaza to Ukraine, the mixed blessings of new military and dual-use technologies, the expansion of new dimensions of warfare in space and cyber, apparently profound changes in our national security strategy, and dramatic national debt that constrains opportunities and choices regarding defense. In the face of all this, Dave brings to this conversation today many decades of thinking deeply about American defense. We should be grateful to RAND for providing the platform for Dave's work. This decades-long deep thinking seems to have worked out. Dave's writings and reports are grounded in reality, but enlightened not only by what's possible in terms of national defense, but what is necessary. For many years, Dave has been a senior and international defense researcher at RAND. From 2009 until 2014, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development. This was his second tour as a Deputy Assistant Secretary. Prior to joining the Office of the Secretary of Defense, he was a Senior Defense Analyst and Director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program for RAND Project Air Force. At Project Air Force, he worked from 1985 until 1993, and again from 1995 until 2009. From 93 until 95, Dave served his first tour as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. That's where we met. Prior to joining RAND, he was a member of the Foreign Service, serving from 1980 to 85, and before that, he was an officer in the United States Air Force from 1973 to 1978. Dave holds an MPA in International Relations from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, now the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and a bachelor's degree in International Affairs and Political Science from the United States Air Force Academy. It's fitting to recall that the informal motto of the Woodrow Wilson School was, quote, "in the nation's service." Dave has lived up to this prescription. Some of his recent writings are Operating Low-Cost Reusable Unmanned Aerial Vehicles in Contested Environment, Restoring U.S. Power Projection Capabilities Responding to the 2018 National Defense Strategy, Improving Force Development within the U.S. Department of Defense, Diagnosis and Potential Prescriptions, and so on. Of particular interest to me, because I think it's so powerful, is a more recent report from RAND, Inflection Point: How to Reverse the Erosion of U.S. and Allied Military Power and Influence. I want you to, as we proceed, please consider the following from Dave's RAND biography. China will not give us 5 months or even 5 weeks to position a force to counter aggression by them. Their force is large enough, capable enough, and ready enough that they can decide when to initiate hostilities, and it could be a matter of 5 days that we have to position ourselves to cope with that. Dave, over to you.
Paul, thanks very much for that introduction, very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in. I had a quick opportunity to scan through some of the people on the call, and I will say I've learned from many of you. I'm going to call out Jim Fitzsimons in particular, who is a wargamer extraordinaire and an analyst extraordinaire, and has always been very generous in sharing the results of his excellent work up at the Naval War College with us as researchers, and it has greatly enhanced our understanding of key operational problems. Paul mentioned our work Inflection Point. That's a report we published about a year and a half ago. The title might be a little bit overused, but I think it's apt, and we chose it for two reasons. One, I think as a nation right now, we're at a bit of an inflection point in the sense that we cannot any longer take for granted or assume that our future leaders are going to pursue the kind of international role that U.S. leaders have pursued and have advocated for since the end of World War II. And I don't need to dwell on all the evidence for that assertion. The role that this nation chooses to play or not to play in the next 3 years could have very profound implications for the international system as well as for our own security. Then at the operational level, for many of the reasons that Paul mentioned, we're at an inflection point as well. I don't need to tell anyone on this call that since the 1990s, when China and the rest of the world first observed the military prowess exhibited by U.S. military forces in Operation Desert Storm, they've been working very hard to make sure we can't do to them what we did to Saddam Hussein twice, what we did to Serbia, what we did to Afghanistan. And you have to say, at least with regard to China, their efforts are bearing fruit. When we assess the probable course of a conflict between the United States, its allies and partners, and China over a Taiwan scenario, for example, again, you all know that things very often don't go well from our perspective. And the more we dig into this set of operational challenges, the clearer it becomes that simply buying more and better stuff for our forces, different weapons, different munitions, different platforms, in and of itself is, while necessary, not going to be enough to actually move the needle against this significant and still evolving, still growing threat. This is what the world looked like, the battle space looked like on the night before Operation Desert Storm kicked off. Those red circles you see in Iraq represent roughly the ranges provided by their fixed SAM systems, SA-2, SA-3, to some degree SA-6s, around their major urban centers and two important military installations in the West. You might be able to see faint red circles coming out of Iraq, representing the range of the Scuds, the Al-Husseins, and the few longer range surface-to-surface ballistic missiles that they had. This was not a set of military capabilities that seriously challenged our ability to deploy to the theater, to organize and prepare for counteroffensive operations, and then to subdue Iraq's armed forces. And the operational concept that we used for that opening campaign, opening conflict of the post-Cold War era, has carried us through pretty well against the state adversaries that we fought since that time. Success, however, can breed complacency. And the success that our forces have enjoyed against the Iraqs, the Serbias, the Afghanistans of the world, I think to some degree has impeded our willingness to innovate and to face the fact that we need some pretty significant changes to the way we fight and the stuff we fight with in order to meet those challenges. And if that was what the world looked like then, this is what it looks like now. Those circles around the periphery and inside China represent the ranges provided by very modern, long-range, redundant SAM systems. Breaking that air defense is going to be much more difficult, obviously, than it was to deal with Iraq's or indeed Serbia's. And of course, the colors emanating from the Chinese coast represent the range and density of their missile forces, not just the PLARF, but also air-delivered and maritime-delivered weapons, well beyond the second island chain. And these weapons are targeted by an increasingly sophisticated and redundant over-the-horizon targeting command and control system. If you think that you can successfully defeat aggression by an adversary in this environment, using the operational concepts that work so well in this environment, think again. And Jim, please weigh in here if I'm saying things that you don't agree with based on your gaming. And we will obviously leave plenty of questions for plenty of time for questions and interactions afterwards. So all this is by way of saying, again, dealing with this class of threat, and the threat's still growing, is going to require that we figure out a very different way to fight. And our analysis in gaming has pointed to two major areas where change is necessary. The most obvious is that we can no longer rely on an approach to power projection that is essentially expeditionary. Paul cut to the chase when he said, the 5 months we had to build the Iron Mountain on the Arabian Peninsula will be in no way representative of the time we have to prepare should China choose to aggress against our interests in the Western Pacific. I think 5 days would be a more prudent planning assumption. Well, you can't do that when the bulk of the combat power you need to conduct operations is 6,000 miles away. So how do you posture yourself to bring decisive combat power to bear within days of a decision to intervene without simply giving the enemy more stuff to shoot at, right? Piling up more F-15s at Kadena Air Base or indeed B-2 bombers at Andersen and Guam is simply exposing yourself to the high risk of losing those very valuable platforms. And indeed potentially provoking China to come and draw down some of your key icons of military power. So that's change one. Change two, the importance, what our opening gambit usually is in these conflicts against the regional adversaries. We first break their command and control. We shatter their air defenses. We gain air superiority, information superiority of the battle space. Certainly in all the wars we've fought, we've had maritime dominance as well. And having done that, then the bulk of our efforts then swing toward attacking the operational and strategic centers of gravity that were the objective of the operation to begin with. When our blue teams come into a war game implicitly or explicitly using this approach against China, what they're doing is playing into Chinese counter-intervention strategy, in effect giving the Chinese the window of opportunity and time they need to put 100,000 PLA onto the island of Taiwan. In the face of this very intensive anti-access area denial complex that they've erected, we nevertheless have to find a way to locate, track, identify, engage, and attack the operational center of gravity from the opening hours of the conflict, not days or weeks later once we've created a more benign environment for the joint force. These are easily articulated objectives, and I think will be part of any future joint operating concept that the department explicitly devises. The key question is, how do you actually create the capabilities you need to implement, to execute it? The forces we have today, I think it's needless to say, do not have the capabilities they need to fight this way. I'm going to go further out on the limb and say the forces we are currently programming to buy in this fit-up will lack key capabilities necessary to execute this concept. That doesn't mean we can't impose some significant costs on a PLA intervention or invasion. We can. And Replicator and Hellscape are going a long way toward helping us do that. But I fear that people will say, got it, we've deployed 10,000 one-way attack drones on Taiwan. We've created this porcupine. Job done. Let's go back to business as usual with the rest of the force. When our blue teams are given that kind of force to fight with in a 2030 or 2035 scenario, yes, they can impose some significant costs on the invader, but they still lack key capabilities that would give us confidence that we can actually deny his objectives and prevail in this scenario. Now, obviously, the details of this kind of analysis can't be discussed here, but in broad strokes, we have to be able to do a couple things that Hellscape alone does not equip us to do. One of those is, so it's great to attrit the invasion force, the amphibious forces in particular. It's good if we can also attrit forces that may be arriving by air, whether by air assault or airborne attack. And there's talk in the open literature about ways to do that with Hellscape-like systems. That's all good. But if Red can secure some kind of a lodgment and then can find a workable port on the west coast of Taiwan with which to flow supplies, troops, and materiel onto the island, we have a problem. And closing a big industrial facility like Taichung or Taipei Port is going to take more than handfuls of Jasmine and Tilam lobbed into the battle space. These are tough facilities that particularly are difficult to prevent ROROs with off ramps from using. So we need to fill that gap. The other thing we need to do is find a way to contest for air superiority over the battle space over Taiwan and its surrounding areas. If Red has a port, if Red owns the air over Taiwan, Red can reinforce, Red can resupply, and Red can protect its lodgment against largely against U.S. air attack. Conversely, if we do not have air superiority, or at least if we can't deny Red air superiority over the island, we cannot reinforce, resupply, or protect our partner on the island. I liken that situation to us asking the Taiwans, in effect, to do what Hitler asked Rommel to do in northern France in June 1944. Maneuver, conduct complex ground operations in the presence of an enemy that has air superiority. It's not going to go well from our perspective. So we need to really focus our efforts to develop innovative and robust concepts and redundant approaches for denying those ports and for getting more lethality into the air over Taiwan, even when the basis from which we generate air combat power, i.e. carriers, land-based air bases in the first and second island chains, are under intense and repeated attacks by Chinese missiles. My colleagues and I have done some work on these things. I'm sure that many on this call have ideas about that as well. We're talking to our sponsors in the building and suggesting that these are important focus areas for their force development. I think I'll leave it there for the moment and see if people have reactions, comments, questions about that.
You've laid out a real operational level of war problem for us in the China-Taiwan scenario and region that has obviously strategic implications. Is it only there and only against China that you see this hold back, push out capability emerging? Or is it, given proliferation being what it is it against other competitors as well? That's my first question.
Yeah, it is certainly not only China that manifests these capabilities. China is the apotheosis of the anti-access area denial capability, but other adversaries are striving to get similar capabilities. Starting in 2014, we began wargaming the defense of the Baltic states against a determined Russian invasion. And we found many of the same dynamics in that warfight that we see in the Taiwan warfight. Because of the way NATO was postured, certainly back in 2015, 2016, 2017, we did not have anything like the kind of combat power needed to effectively defend the eastern flank of the alliance. So again, we were in a position of having to deploy large-scale combat forces to the theater over time, likely facing a situation where the adversary would initiate hostilities before we had enough combat power forward to effectively defend. Threats to fixed facilities like air bases and command and control lines of communication in rear areas are being, demonstrated by the Russians today. So a reconstituted Russian force could pose qualitatively similar challenges to a NATO operation in the defense of the eastern flank going forward. I do think, however, that the Taiwan scenario, if you only could pick one to motivate your force planning and modernization, would be the appropriate one to use because A, it's the most stressing, B, it's highly plausible, C, important U.S. interests are at stake in that scenario, and many of the challenges you encounter there are similar to challenges that other adversaries could pose, if not quite as severe.
Let me see. I've got a couple more questions that I want to pursue. One is directly related to what you've just laid out and to your illustrations of the China-Taiwan scenario. It seems to me that worldwide, and including the harbor in Norfolk, but worldwide, that we are going to have to face up to being in the weapon engagement zone all the time. That's something that's quite different and quite new. I mean, we've seen it coming for some time. It's the basis for China's anti-access area denial strategy in the Pacific to put maritime, air, and ground forces in the weapons engagement zone permanently. What do you think are some of the responses and solutions to that prior to, but also during?
Absolutely right. So for a long time, we've been incorporating into our war games the likelihood, if not the certainty, that China, Russia, other adversaries would be disrupting our mobilization and deployment operations inside CONUS before the commencement of hostilities, right? Transcom is going to be under cyber attack. Our power projection hubs will be under cyber attack before the war goes kinetic. Our society might be under cyber attack as a way of undermining national unity and support for a defensive operation. So we've seen that coming, and doing what you can to harden those critical networks needed to conduct the mobilization and deployment obviously is an important priority in that phase. But we also see once hostilities begin, not only will those cyber attacks escalate from reversible to non-reversible kinds of things, but you'll see kinetic attacks in the United States as well. And the capacity of both Russia and China to do that is growing. I don't know how many people saw the press reporting about a week ago that China has revealed the possibility of putting containerized missiles on things that look like merchant ships. That could lead to an order of magnitude of expansion in the cruise missile threat facing CONUS from what we've seen just a few years ago. The Ukrainians, others have been showing us the threat that could be presented by one-way attack drones. And those don't necessarily have to be expensive, long-range things coming off of merchant-type vessels. They can be coming out of someone's garage a mile outside of Norfolk Port or Langley Air Force Base or Buckley or any of our other power projection hubs. No one really wants to spend a lot of money on counter-UAS systems. They don't play to our institutional prerogatives. They're not helping us directly project power into the combat zone. But I think we're going to have to take seriously the threat that even small one-way attack drones can pose to soft targets like aircraft sitting in the open on ramps at air bases. That's a bill we don't want to pay, but I think we're going to have to pay.
So I must tell you that this is reminiscent of Herman Kahn's conversation with the Air Force in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when he pointed out that forward deployed European-based Air Force bombers were extremely vulnerable to Soviet attack, Soviet
Yeah.
surprise attack, Soviet preemptive decapitating attack. And then the alternative was okay. And then the SAC, that the Strategic Air Command that we grew up with, was CONUS based almost entirely for the most part.
Yep.
So that was an example of sort of when you're under fire, you have the opportunity and the alternative, for instance, to change your posture. And in that
Yeah.
case, they pulled back forces, they didn't pull back commitments. And it was, I mean, I don't know what the expenditure was involved in that. There must have been some involved. And of course, we needed then longer range aircraft, but it was not an order of magnitude change. What you're describing, however, seems to me to infer the necessity which Eisenhower avoided at all costs, almost a permanent militarization on the one hand, and you just alluded to that. Nobody wants uh, to pay for counter drone defenses here domestically, but it's also uh, with regard to forward-based forces as well, where, and this is something you haven't directly addressed, but I want to get at, which is, well, you're not going to be able to bring things forward. What does that mean about keeping things forward? In other words, this posture question. And you'll have some views on that. I'm very interested in your views on those 2 points.
Yeah. Um, it was it, it was Albert Wolstetter, by the way, who conducted the famous bomber study. And LeMay didn't like it, but he understood it. um, we will be bringing things forward um, because we have to. The key is that they have to be postured in such a way that they're not inviting attack by the enemy, not creating additional vulnerabilities. So you can't create an iron air base on Guam. The offense defense trade off is such that offense is going to overwhelm whatever active defenses you can put in there. Passive defenses can help with the margin, but at the end of the day, and we learn this from the Ukrainians every day, if you're sitting at a fixed facility, if you have a large signature, you're not going to survive on the modern battlefield. So increasingly, our forward posture has to be characterized by deception, by redundancy, by hardening, and above all, by mobility. And this is the genius of hellscape, right? Thousands of small things stored in warehouses, taken out into complex terrain prior to the commencement of hostilities, operated by small teams. Increasingly, we have to do to the PLA what they're doing to us. We have to give them a scud hunting problem, right? I don't want them to know where my air power is. I want it to be moving around. I want it to be hard to find. I'm a fan of the Marine Littoral Regiment, the Army's fire systems that can be uh, set up, shot, torn down, moved in 15 minutes. Increasingly, our posture within the threat ring in the theater has to be characterized by these sorts of features. At the same time, um, we we have to improve the ability of longer range forces to conduct high tempo operations, again with short warning at the outset of hostilities. So the United States of America has the world's most potent bomber force, about 96 operational B-1s, B-52s, B-2s. But investments will be needed to ensure that that force can operate from a high tempo on short warning from places like Alaska and Australia, which, to be clear, will not be in complete sanctuary, but will be at the edge of the enemy's threat systems and more defendable than things closer in. And of course, undersea remains a domain where we can have some confidence of being able to operate with stealth to escape observation and attack by the enemy. So I think the future posture we're moving toward has to be characterized by those kinds of characteristics to be viable. And again, At the operational level, this is all things, these are all things we need to do. At the strategic level, if we're moving to this kind of posture for the first time in a long time, we're presenting the adversary with things they have not been prepared to deal with, right? Going back to Desert Storm, we have presented a fairly predictable, if not static, target to our adversaries. They know 30 years in advance we're going to have fifth generation airplanes. They know how many aircraft carriers we're going to have. They know how we're going to operate those. They have been preparing capabilities explicitly designed to counter those kinds of platforms. How about if we start confronting them with things they haven't been prepared to counter? I think, again, at the operational level, those things clearly have utility. At the strategic level, they, I think, have outsized deterrent value.
Thank you. I have one technical question and then another question about sort of geopolitics. The technical question is, given your long tenure at RAND and RAND's association with the Air Force, your former service as an Air Force officer, and the Air Force's leading role, not no longer exclusive, but leading role in stealth for aircraft platforms,
Yeah.
airborne platforms. Uh, are you in a position, and I don't want to embarrass you because I don't know what you can say or if you've even thought about this, but are you in a position to comment on the potential for stealth? And for this group, I'll use the naval issue for platforms at sea. I've had conversations with former commanding officers of USS Zumwalt, the lead of the Zumwalt class
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
ships. And his assertion is that it's not as good as it could have been. It would need to be better, but it could be better because there are various dimensions of stealth. It's not just radar posture,
Yeah.
but that kind of approach can really reduce, limit, inhibit an opponent's ability to not only target and attack, but to locate in the first place and detect in the first place naval ships at sea. Now, I understand that we're not ready to do this and it would take a lot of changes, but can you comment on that? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Um, I have some thoughts, but I don't know that they would be worthy of this group. What I do know, first of all, I'm a mere political scientist, so I'm not in a position to do independent engineering or physics level analysis of these things. And the things I have observed other people saying, I can't, share it in this forum. So I think it would be best. So the one thing I can say, Paul, and this is blindingly obvious, that there are two ways to hide. One is by being invisible. The other is by looking like everything else, hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
And this is the nightmare of, if you will, the Chinese creating arsenal ships out of things that look like Costco merchant vessels. That can give even a superior force difficulty sorting the wheat from the chaff and preventing them from approaching, within range of our shores. I don't know if that's a viable approach for our Navy or not, but
Robbie Harris, I'm going to call on you here in a minute on that subject, if you don't mind. But let's shift for just a moment then to your political science dimension. Some will say, some are saying at the moment that this is too hard. We simply can't be entangled in and endangered by our relationship by allies, Eurasian allies, and that we should withdraw because we have to, because there is no technical, military technical alternative to withdrawal from those kinds of relationships, commitments, alliances, and so on. What do you think about that?
So first you have to look at the cost and consequences of U.S. withdrawal. None of us has lived in a world where the United States was not actively putting its thumb on the scale of international relations in defense of democracy, independent decision making, and regional stability. I think and this is where the strategic level of our inflection point comes in. For many reasons, I do not want to run the experiment of what the world looks like when the United States stops making itself available to the defense of common interests of the most important democratically governed countries in the world. Moreover, for people who say we can no longer afford it, I say bullshit. We're spending about 3% of GDP on defense. We know that 5%, 7% is not inconsistent with a growing, vibrant economy. We happen to live in a tougher neighborhood than we lived in 20 years ago. And maintaining a credible defense posture in that tougher neighborhood is just going to cost us more money. I hate debt. I don't have any personally. I want to raise taxes so that we're not, outspending our income. But I'm not an economist. My economist colleagues here tell me that a 5% GDP rate for defense is consistent with continued economic growth if we take appropriate steps to balance income with expenditures. So, and then finally, at the operational level, at the no shit level of life, I need to take 100 ships in the Taiwan Strait in 36 hours. If anyone wants to tell me the United States of America can't figure out how to do that, I'm going to say they're wrong. Now, the Chinese will make it hard, right? There's not going to be 100 ships in the Taiwan Strait. There are going to be 1,000 ships in the Taiwan Strait. So you have to have a sensing grid to sort the wheat from the chaff. You have to have weapons that can penetrate a very significant enemy air defense. You have to close that port. You've got to contest for air superiority. These are all things that we, the United States, can do if we put our mind to it. And moreover, the final thing I'll say is not a week goes by when there's not some reporting about Xi Jinping firing an admiral or general for corruption. Our enemies are not 10 feet tall. I would recommend to anyone's reading who would be interested in this, a work by my colleague Tim Heath, who's a longtime China expert, who sort of specializes in identifying areas of the PLA where they lack confidence in themselves. We can exploit that uncertainty. We can present them with new problems. Everything that I see from concept development and force planning and analysis shows us that this is not undoable by any means.
Well, yeah, I will refer folks to TX's of my article in January 2019 proceedings. Listen, one of the things that industry has learned over the past 5 or 6 years, is we're able now to containerize almost everything. Everything from Tomahawk missiles to an Aegis fire control system now can be containerized and placed on almost any platform you want to place it on. Now, what TX and I have written is converting merchant ships to missile merchants. It's very much of a doable do. The only question is how many missiles Navy wants to put aboard each one of those ships. The best idea is not too many, not to have too many eggs in one basket. But we can put lots and lots of missiles out there on lots of platforms. Platforms don't have to cost a lot of money. Is that what you're looking for, Paul?
Yeah, I think so, because this is one of the aspects of change, and Dave has put his finger on it. Hiding in plain sight, I think, is sort of the category we're talking about here. Then it's going to be increasingly necessary for us to take approaches, not only those approaches, but approaches like that. So, yeah, thank you very much.
It's a doable do.
So, Barney Rubel, you're up, and I want to ask you, you haven't heard everything that Dave has talked about, but he has made the case for the fact that it is really going to be hard to get forward and to stay forward. But you've written a tremendous article in the January issue of proceedings about what happened to command of the sea. What questions can you ask of Dave, and what implications do you think all of these developments have for our aspirations for this being a naval audience after all, our aspirations for command of the sea? Barney, did you get all of that? Can you answer any of that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, I've been writing about command of the sea for a number of years now, but well, there's two things. First of all, in the larger picture, it's a matter of risk management. The basic principle, I think, is that you don't want to risk your maintenance of global command of the sea by suffering the wrong kind and too much loss in the process of exercising it in regional contingencies, right? So that means you need forces that are risk tolerant and the loss of which won't affect your overall command of the sea. So that's one thing. And that fits exactly with what Dave and everybody else is saying about dispersed forces using smaller ships with armed with missiles, stuff like that, stuff that it is risk tolerant, even in a Taiwan scenario.
Yeah.
The other issue I'm working on, I guess you could say, is organization. In other words, I started back in 2013. I think I made a pitch to the SDG on flotillas. We ought to establish a flotilla in the Far East that is there all the time and is composed of a heterogeneous group of manned, unmanned, and whatever kind of forces. And that flotilla, I think, ought to report directly to the GIFMIC, whether it's Pac Fleet, the four-star GIFMIC, whatever. The third and seventh fleets were designed as mobile task forces composed of capital ships, and they don't lend themselves well to a what you would call a regionally stationary,
Mhm.
dispersed organization. So the flotilla ought to be established, and that flotilla would then think about its mission and then put a demand on the Navy for what it needs, forces. Uh, I also recommend that the initial flotilla staff be stood up at Newport and begin wargaming and to figure out, the ins and outs of deploying forward permanently, the logistics and everything else about it. Once that flotilla staff has got a bunch of insight gained by wargaming under its belt, then it moves out to either Hawaii or maybe farther forward in Japan somewhere and starts putting a demand on forces and then starts organizing exercises, stuff like that, and working things out. Without an organization, it's just a bunch of Washington suppositions about things.
Go ahead.
Barney, I resonate with both of those things. Um, Brian Clark and others have written about the need for a hedge force, a force that could go into the teeth of a highly contested environment, put hurt on the enemy without exposing too much of your force of scarce capital intensive vessels, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, B-2 bombers, etc. And with regard to the flotilla, our wargaming tends to focus on the big ones, right? The big wars. But day to day, we've got a gray zone problem in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And in those kinds of environments, there's no substitute for being there, right? 24/7, 365, being a factor in the dynamics of the day-to-day operations there to assure your allies that you're there with them to give the Chinese something other than a free shot at intimidating your allies and partners and things of that nature. So again, I resonate with both of those ideas that you just put out there.
I think the other thing is crisis maneuvering. It may be there be some kind of Chinese bolt out of the blue for Taiwan, but I think it's more likely that some kind of crisis is going to arise. And during crises, naval forces tend to intermingle. I mean, the prototype almost was the 1973 Arab-Israeli War in the Eastern Med, where the U.S. Sixth Fleet and the Soviet Fifth Escadra were all intermingled. I was
Oh,
there. I was part of that. And
wow.
we were, our threat sector was 360 degrees. And we were in a very tactically disadvantageous position because I think it was Henry Kissinger was either Sec State or National Security Advisor. He moved the Forstall group into just south of Crete to be able to intercept Soviet airborne
Oh,
troop transports.
uh-huh.
You remember
Coming into
all that?
Egypt. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, we were just sitting ducks for the Fifth Escadra's anti-ship missiles. Of course, we
Wow.
didn't have any uh, anti-ship weapons or tactics of our own. I spent a lot of time orbiting overhead Soviet formations with 500-pound bombs on my wings, looking
Yeah.
for smoke on the deck that would indicate a missile launch. And if I was still alive, I'd get out a Zippo call that missiles were inbound to the battle group. Then I was supposed to roll in Battle of Midway style on those
Tough
ships.
mission. Yeah.
But I would say that a flotilla composed of a heterogeneous mix of manned and unmanned vessels, all small and risk tolerant, but yet
Hmm.
lethal.
Yeah.
Uh, what that does is shift strategic risk to the Chinese. And that's what
Hmm.
we want to do. That what that does is enhances deterrence, I think.
Yep. Nice.
Thank you very much, Jens. Barney, that was great. If I had a magic wand and I had foundation money, I would finance a RAND study. I'm saying RAND in particular, a non-naval organization study that would include Barney Rubel uh, and Jim Fitzsimons, so we could start getting to the bottom of what's of particular interest, at least to me, but I think to this group, Dave, of the naval implications of all of this. So this is exactly what I hoped was going to come out of your presentation and your comments and your many years of looking at this, because sometimes, it's kind of like my bank account. I know it's getting low, but I'm not doing anything about it, right? It's this lethargy. It's lack of momentum. We've got to get over that and get on with this. Now, I have to tell you, if wishes were worth something, that I'm in favor of big ships and I'm in favor of concentrated firepower, regenerative firepower. But at some point you got to face facts, and if you can't hide them, but they have to be hidden, and so on. You see the logic here. So
Yeah. Yeah.
at least in the meantime, we got to figure out other ways to approach this. Um, so Ted, I'm going to ask Bill Hamlet, who's been very patient, uh, what's on his mind, and then I'm going to call on you. Okay, so stand by. Bill, over to you.
My question follows up on the naval implications of the operational problem you laid out, David. There's been a long-term underinvestment in mine warfare,
Yeah.
including offensive mine warfare. And the problem that you laid out, that need to get hundreds of ships across the Taiwan Strait to seize a port and hold that port for follow-on forces, it just seems to me to be tailor-made for offensive mine warfare from the U.S. and our allies and Taiwan. Do you sense any appetite for increased investments in that warfare area?
Absolutely. That was the next point I was going to make following on to Paul. So thank you for that, Bill. As I understand it today, the only way the United States military has to deliver mines into a battle space is by airplanes with quick strike. I'm here to tell you, airplanes are not going to be flying over the Taiwan Strait 2 days into this war. If they are, they're not coming home. And so we need a way to, on demand, on order, after the commencement of hostilities, close the shipping channels into these ports. And I think finding an offensive, survivable way to lay mines in those shipping channels is a key priority for us. The solution that seems obvious to me as a non-naval person is large diameter submersibles, probably living in Sasebo, that are put out to sea on warning and stand by for orders to steam into the strait and deliver those mines when needed. Our blue teams without that capability have been adjudicated as being incapable of confidently denying ports to the adversary. So, that's just, I'm sure that's just one obvious mission for offensive mining that emerges from our wargaming and analysis.
So just as a point of order, I want to mention two things. Thank you for that, gents. The first is that not too long ago, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force's primary capability was mine warfare. And they, in many ways, were the gap filler for our own lack of that in the Western Pacific. So that's one thing. The second is we've talked a lot about the Taiwan Strait today, but let me point out that it's not just the Taiwan Strait, and I realize that's a sort of a particular
Sure.
friction point, but it's all of the. If you look at this from my perspective, it's how do you seal the exits from the first island chain, and it's many straits. In other words, it's not just one strait, and that this mining capability, whether it's UUVs or pre-positioned capabilities and so on, which is also obviously an opportunity. These are all things that really, really need to be thought through, especially in this context of the operating forces themselves are not going to be able to do this the way we're used to doing it, but that has to be done. There's a double whammy problem here, though, and that is that nobody on this side of the Pacific ever wants to think about mines. So, we have to kind of get over that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ted Voorhees, are you ready?
Yeah, thanks. And Dave, thanks for your presentation, which was great, and the inflection paper also great. If I can, I want to just shift the focus for a second and get your thoughts. Shift the focus from what we've been talking about thus far, which is basically, okay, if there's an invasion of Taiwan, what kind of force posture do we need to block it?
Yeah.
I want to shift away from that to how do we deter the Chinese from even thinking about attempting an invasion of Taiwan? I just want your thoughts on this for a second. So immediately one thinks of two ways you deter someone from a regional aggression. One is you develop such an overmatch of military power in that theater that your adversary would say, there's no way I would be successful in this aggression. I can't do it. That's obviously not on the table here. With the region being Taiwan, that's just not on the table. So the other way would be, this is just me talking, somehow you convey to the adversary, we may not be able to stop you from invading Taiwan, but if you tried to do that, we will hurt you so badly in other places and on other assets that you possess that are critical to your continued welfare and existence that you should not even consider an aggression of that kind. Now, I'm not talking about nuclear, but I'm talking about some way of developing a credible operational strategy and conveying it to the adversary that would deter him from doing what you worry that he may be thinking about doing. So I just put that to you. Is this something worth thinking and talking about in addition to how can we block or thwart or defeat an actual invasion?
Yeah. Those are great points, Ted. And we have done a lot of thinking and some analysis about this. You're absolutely right. Overmatch vis-a-vis China is gone. It's not coming back. So what about cost and position? We've got both evidence from wargaming on this and evidence from sort of logic-based analysis about it. And the wargaming, we've actually played games where the blue team, recognizing that they're not well positioned to actually defeat the invasion, go off and attack China elsewhere. They attack Chinese forces in Djibouti. They sink every naval combatant in the South China Sea. They go after the Northern Fleet, etc. At the end of the game, the red team sachets into the room and said, "You just took away our Navy. We will happily trade our Navy for Taiwan. In 10 years, we'll have a new Navy." Now, I'm being a little flip about it, but the point here is if the leadership in Beijing, whether it's Xi Jinping or someone else, commits the nation to a military operation to unify Taiwan with the mainland, it's very, very difficult to identify things that at that moment in time they value more that we could also hold at risk short of risking nuclear escalation. Obviously, they value more their continued hold on power. Can you find ways to threaten the CCP's hold on power? If you could, would you pull that trigger knowing that this is a nuclear armed adversary? So if you're going to rely on cost and position for deterrence, it involves finding a sweet spot where you can hold at risk things they value at least as much as success in a Taiwan scenario, but not so much that by attacking them, you push them toward nuclear escalation. And frankly, we find that to be not a promising approach. So there's a third way. The third way is confronting them with the prospect of failure without having overmatch. It's fielding niche capabilities that are tailored to attack their concept of operations, deny them confidence of success, even in the absence of overmatch. That's the kind of thing we're looking for in our force planning and analysis, and we're beginning to find answers to that. Hellscape is going to be one part of that answer.
So just to one follow up, are you saying that, and again, I'm putting nuclear completely off the table. I'm not talking about nuclear, but are you saying that in the thinking that you've seen, there is no way to impose other costs on China through military action in other theaters and not in the Taiwan Straits that wouldn't trigger a Chinese nuclear reaction to our hurting them in all these other places, including Beijing, including the South China Sea and Djibouti and all the rest?
We haven't found that sweet spot. We haven't found Chinese interests outside China that rise to the level of Taiwan that we could hold at risk and thereby deter the Taiwan operation. You could go into China and start attacking strategic type targets like CCP headquarters or, the internal police that they use for population control, things like that. But to the extent you're doing that credibly and posing what looks like an existential threat to the regime, even if we're not putting nuclear weapons on the table, this is a two-sided game. If the regime's at risk, they may well reach for that tool. And so it seems risky to say the least. Moreover, it's very difficult for us to confidently get inside the heads of our adversary, right? How does Xi himself view these things? How might an alternative leadership view these things? We have no control over that. What we can control is how many ships I can kill in the Taiwan Strait. I can control my ability to close a port. I can control my ability to push combat power over the battle space. And I can convey to China in multiple ways, we've got tricks up our sleeve that you have not prepared to deal with. We can deny you confidence of success in this operation. And for anyone on the call who has familiarity with amphibious operations, I don't need to emphasize the complexity of a large-scale amphibious operation under fire. It's tough. They know it's tough, and they know they don't have any meaningful experience in it. So that leads us to continued examination of this third approach, if you will.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I want to follow up just a little bit, and I don't even need an answer, I don't think, but this notion of China being off the table, in other words, that we can't attack the Chinese mainland and so on. That's I can see how that's sort of the hardest problem one of the hardest problems we're facing. I don't know what the answer to it is, but it seems to me
Let
that
me note that I didn't intend to say that we can't attack the Chinese mainland. There's a
no,
spectrum of
I know,
targets on the Chinese mainland.
but there is a sense, and I think you reflected it, unless I misunderstood, that the Chinese are on a hair trigger. This is my sense. Let's put it this way. My sense is the Chinese are on a hair trigger. Don't you dare uh, come into our territory. We can do anything we want, say the Chinese, but don't you dare come into our territory. Now, the if that's the operating presumption, then we're obviously at a disadvantage. I don't know the way around that though, because after all, if they're crazy about this stuff, then they're crazy about this stuff. In other words, that they have their own way of thinking. And as you said, maybe Tim Heath and others can strive to get to the bottom of this, but it's a very interesting and very central issue.
I'll say this, and again, none of us can get inside the heads of the Chinese leaders, but in our war games, and again, Jim, jump in here if you have not seen this or have another view. If and as in the war game, high explosive starts detonating on Chinese territory, whether it's got a Taiwan flag painted on the side or a US flag, our red teams are at pains to demonstrate that they are not Iraq, they're not Serbia, they're not Afghanistan, they don't have to sit there and take it. The United States is not a sanctuary. And so there will be at least demonstration attacks on power projection hubs in Alaska and Hawaii on the west coast of the United States. And their capacity to do that is increasing. There are some interesting military targets on the mainland that contribute directly to the military operation on Taiwan. I think those should be in play as consideration as part of our operational concept. But the vast majority of our kinetic operations are going to be offshore on the forces themselves operating over and around Taiwan and beyond.
Yeah. This is interesting because if we were having this conversation in 1965 or 1975 or 1985, the whole notion of, the homelands are not off the table. We all, of course, yeah, we've internalized that a long time ago and we're dealing with it. But the message or the lesson from that was deterrence is key. We have to, and we have to be able to put ourselves in and stay in a position of deterrence so that we don't have to give up what we hold dear, but we can prevent having to fight over it. Anyway, that's my editorial comment. Thank you so much. Barney Rubel, you're next, and I want to call on you, but I'm going to warn you that I'm going to ask you a question before you ask Dave a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So, Barney, what's the difference between your flotilla concept and the U.S. Seventh Fleet?
The U.S. Seventh Fleet is a mobile, capital ship centric organization. I'm sure it has a JFMIC, but I think it's aboard what is it, the Blue Ridge or I don't know where their JFMIC is now. They're mock, but I would say that a flotilla would be a more junior organization. I don't want a 3-star in charge of the flotilla. It ought to be more junior, and it ought to be, couched under a lot of cement somewhere in the Philippines, I guess, for the JFMIC. But I just think a flotilla ought to be independent of a mobile maneuvering numbered fleet and just be a different construct altogether instead of being a task force under 7th Fleet. I think that it gets lost like that. So that's my feeling. I might be wrong, but that's just my feeling on it. What I was going to say is that in 2010, I was over in China talking to a number of folks, including one of their retired admirals, uh, who was complaining about our missile defense, our national missile defense efforts. He said, all we want to do is just be able to get one warhead through so that, you have to make the calculation, is losing Los Angeles worth intervening in a local affair, i.e. Taiwan. To me, that indicated that from the outset, it's going to be a game of nuclear chicken. Nuclear is not uh, a follow-on second thought or anything. It's going to be front and center from the outset. You saw Putin threaten nukes, maybe euphemistically, but he threatened nukes right off the bat. The West gets involved, and hey, everything's on the table. I think that's going to happen immediately. So you can't consider a response to Taiwan invasion or even maybe a quarantine without thinking through how we're going to conduct a nuclear game of chicken with the Chinese.
Senior officers I know have made the point that in those circumstances, the whole notion of which command is supported and which command, regional and functional commands is supporting and so on. This has to be really rethought, that the current arrangements are not sufficient to deal with these extreme situations. So there's a lot of UCP stuff changing now, but I think there's a lot more that has to change. That doesn't even get into whether the War Department is organized appropriately and so on. A lot of us Navy folks are suffering not so much in silence anymore over the way the Navy has been shunted aside. And so the way we organize for all of this is going to be as important as the way we produce and acquire and deploy. Just another editorial comment that's probably self-evident.
So I was playing around with the general idea of the hedge force concept. I think I've heard the CNO talk about a little bit, let's figure out how to complex the opposing forces targeting problem by distributing what we would normally think of as a very large surface combatant into, a surface combatant with a whole bunch of other things where my emitter is over there and my missiles are over there and electronic warfare is way out in front, whatever, to make what we normally think of as a destroyer into something that's much harder to target and affect as a way of presenting ourselves into the WES without giving up the game all at once. And that harkens to me the idea of, well, what is a battleship? And could you make the functional equivalent of a battleship out of one medium-sized thing with people in it, with a whole bunch of smaller things that are like the rest of the distributed surface force? And you can make a handful of them and make it just really, really hard on the opposing side. And if you don't mind my just adding a little twist to all this, how does the kind of the topography of China with respect to first and second island chain and choke points fit into, our fleet strategy in terms of architecture? If that's too long-winded, I can break that up into pieces.
Dave, are you prepared to take any of that Navy stuff on?
No, not in this audience. No. Given my background, I wouldn't venture to. In our wargaming, the PLA Navy, when it ventures outside of the protection of its integrated air defense, of the land-based air defense, doesn't do very well for reasons that you all know better than I do. Some of the lethality is delivered by bombers, but much of it comes from undersea and from other Navy platforms. But the whole notion of bottling up the plan, using choke points, that's an area that I don't have any expertise in.
Nick, do you want to follow up, or does that satisfy you?
Shoot.
You're on.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. I was looking for lower my hand. All right, sorry for asking a question that was a little off the rails there, but I appreciate you humoring me.
For this audience, it's very
No,
relevant.
it's not off the rails, Nick. It's in fact,
I'm just
David, also you mentioned back in the about 1993, 94, Lieutenant General Shang Guangquai, who at the time was a J2 equivalent, made the point about one bomb on LA is all they needed to deter the US. And that was when their forces obviously were far fewer than now. The other data point from the mid-90s was by one of the Chinese think tanks associated with the Ministry of Defense, um, in which he tried to define strategic attack on China under the grounds that China would, despite no first use doctrine, China would use nukes under a strategic attack. And he then went on to define a carrier strike group approaching China closely as, quote, a strategic attack. So I think we have to be very aware of a difference in definitions. I also want to back up the comment that Beijing would be perfectly willing to trade their entire navy for continued support for the CCP in Beijing. That's their only strategic priority, is keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power.
That's their principal strategic priority. Absolutely. And again, getting back to Ted's comments, if we had a credible way to hold that at risk, it's not clear we would want to pull that trigger because of the presence of their nuclear force. And with regard to cost imposition in general as a means of deterrence, we have a systemic problem here. I don't think anyone would debate the assertion that China cares more about Taiwan than we do. They say it every day. China's leaders, arguably China's population, is more willing to endure pain over Taiwan than the United States is. With that underlying reality, getting into a cost imposition contest to see who gives up first it's not likely to go well from our perspective. So again, that drives us to looking for ways to confront China with the credible capability to deny their invasion at the conventional level, even in the absence of overmatch. That's the space we're working in as analysts right now.
I don't want to get in. First, I applaud all of the people in all of the services who try to war game against China. It makes eminent sense that we should be prepared to deal with an adversary under various scenarios. The strategic question for me goes back to the elements of power and how you deal with an adversary, and the military should be the last element of power employed. In all likelihood, the majority of you would agree with that. I've escorted senior retired Navy officials to Taiwan on a number of occasions and have dealt with Taiwan for over 50 years, as I have with the mainland of China for the last 40 years. I don't come to the same conclusion as most wargamers do when they decide that they're going to have to deal with China. There are other alternatives, but maybe this isn't the place to deal with it. I would point out, though, that the failure of the United States to have a particular policy in which they can deal with Taiwan has left Taiwan with an inability to communicate effectively with the United States, of course, its defense issues. Bud has mentioned that maybe Taiwan should be more aggressive about spending money, but spend money on what? They've come up with strategies over time that have, in fact, been effective deterrents to the Chinese in terms of any kind of land invasion. And there are other things that Xi Jinping has to consider. You may notice some of his frequent changes of command lately. He doesn't have full control over just what's going to go on. He's got a lot of opposition in China when it comes to an approach towards Taiwan. That should not be a consideration, though, for war gamers who are trying to figure out how to deal with China. What I have noticed in this conversation, though, is there is no systemic or systematic way of dealing with allies in this process. Japan's prime minister, she has recently put Beijing on alert that she sides with Taiwan on a lot of issues. We let the Philippines down. Despite the fact that we have a defense arrangement with them, when they needed help, we were not there. We didn't take a cent when Xi Jinping's party began to build islands in the sea. We have not been very effective against dealing with their claims in the South China Sea, even though we have international support in many areas. but we have not endorsed the law of the sea. We still have not gone to bat for the law of the sea. Absent some of these legal international standards, the world's not sure where the United States is going to be. Even right now, as I deal with Japan, which I do on a regular basis, there's a great deal of uncertainty among Japanese leadership. Is just what is the United States committed to, other than its own selfish economic interest?
Yep.
I'm sorry to say, I love what you're trying to do in terms of define a force, but I'm not real sure that you're taking into consideration what we can or cannot do with allies in the region, or whether or not China really seriously is concerned about Taiwan. I've been on this Taiwan issue for 50 years, and I'm here to tell you I have experiences that would suggest that maybe Xi Jinping is pipe dreaming. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Al. Dave, you want to respond to that?
There's a lot to agree with there, Al. Your discussion of our, shall I say, fecklessness in the South China Sea is hard to argue with. I think this idea of a flotilla force that would give us a more sustained, more robust, more survivable presence there to deal with these gray zone kinds of challenges would be an answer to that. And much of what you're saying about our allies' uncertainty about our willingness and will to support them in the future is reflected in the concerns that we wrote about at the national level in our book about Inflection Point. I worry about that every day. And to the extent we get that wrong, it almost doesn't matter what we do at the operational military capability level.
Yeah, that's a good warning for all of us defense types. Thanks,
Yeah.
Dave. Bill Hamill, do you have any closing thoughts?
To me, this has just been a great conversation and sobering, like all serious conversations are about defense of Taiwan, I think, and the greater strategic Indo-Pacific situation. David's brought out some really great points about all the ways that China is enhancing its military power in all domains.
Thanks, Bill. And let me say that nobody more than I, although I think many of us appreciate everything that Bill Hamlet is doing across the board, but in particular for this enterprise, Bill has not only been a partner, and through the Naval Institute, we are able to record and have posted on the Naval Institute YouTube channel these sessions, but he's also become my stage manager. And so I have to tell you, I really appreciate that. He's laughing because it's funny. Ted, do you want anything else you want to close up with?
Well, just one question. I asked this a couple months ago in one of these Madison programs, which was basically, what do we know about Xi's risk tolerance? And there was not really many dramatic answers to that question. Maybe there never will be. But here we are months and months later, and we know something more about Trump's risk tolerance, and so does the world. And so I'm going to ask this question again. We talked about, okay, if there are back channel discussions going on, as there doubtless would be, between our leader and their leader, with each making threats. Dave, do you have any thoughts? I mean, I know this is an unanswerable question, but do you have any reactions to that scenario of whether we look better, worse, or you just absolutely can't tell?
Yeah, it is unanswerable, but
risk tolerance.
One thing we know is that even if you're wearing a velvet glove, if the fist underneath it is iron, it gets the adversary's attention. Whatever discussions go on at the highest levels will always be against the backdrop of an underlying military balance or imbalance. And what we at our level as force planners, as military analysts, as operators can do is do the best job we can to help the leaders make good choices so that the military balance underlying their interactions at the national level is favorable. And when Paul introduced me, he used the word erosion. The subtitle of our latest book is How to Reverse the Erosion of U.S. and Allied Military Power and Influence. I don't think anyone on this call would dispute the assertion that military power vis-a-vis China has been eroding for a couple of decades. We need to turn that around so that whatever discussions happen at the national level, our adversaries understand that we have viable military options should the shit hit the fan. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but that's the best I can offer.
Thanks, Dave. Before I close out the formal session and stop the recording, I want to ask one follow-up question at the risk of going over time. Dave, in a recent 2024 commentary article reporting on an interview with you, the interviewer talked about you using the Etruscan word saeculum. I don't know if I got that right, but you get the point. You want to explain what was on your mind when you introduced that word?
The Etruscans had one unit they used to measure time was the saeculum. That was defined as the lifespan of a person relative to a significant national event. So a natural disaster, a war, a regime change. The years that followed that event would be called a saeculum until the death of a person who had witnessed that event. We are at the end of the saeculum of World War II, right? My dad flew a B-17 out of the United Kingdom over Nazi Germany. He and his generation understood the costs and risks that emerge when the United States of America does not assert itself as a power of good in the world. And we've had a consensus about that for a good 80 years. It's probably not a coincidence that my dad, who would be 101 this year, that his generation is gone. And despite the fact that we have written histories and access to all the information in the world, that we no longer at the DNA level embody and feel and understand those lessons from that generation. And we all, I think, share concerns about what the world might look like if our leaders begin to behave in ways that disregard those lessons. So I thought that was a useful way to end the book, if you will. Thanks for the opportunity to share that, Paul.
Sure, Dave. So for those of you on the call, we're now wrapping up the recorded part of our conversation today. But the last thing I want to say is that the references that I provided for you in the invitations, and there are numbers of them, are really terrific. It's a body of work from both from Rand and Dave and Dave and Rand, and it's really very, very useful. And I'm going to make sure that I'll send you a summary of one of them that is particularly important and for your reference and perusal. Thank you, Dave. This has really been terrific. And I not only am I not disappointed, but as soon as I saw some of the things you had written recently, I said, we've got to hear more from Dave. And we went into this knowing that Dave's not a navalist. Dave has different perspectives, but boy, are they central to everything that's facing us. And we really appreciate your commitment to national security. We really appreciate what you've added to that and contributed, and we look forward to much more.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for the endorsement of our work, and thanks certainly for the opportunity to share some of our insights with this terrific group. I really appreciate it.
To give you, ladies and gents, a sense of how committed Dave is, I don't know if this is literally the first time that I laid eyes on Dave, but it was one of the first times. And it was a snowy day. Yeah, I know you know what's up. It was a snowy weekend day, and we were in the Pentagon despite the fact that the rest of Washington was closed down because we were preparing for a major trip to Asia. At least that's what I was there for. And Dave had to be there too. He had skied into the Pentagon in his cross-country skiing outfit, complete with knickers and long socks. So I just wanted that memory has stuck with me ever since. As far as next here, the next first Wednesday Sea Power workshop will be on February 4th, the first Wednesday of the month, surprise, at 4 p.m. Washington time. We're busy working out the schedule because we have conflicting commitments and so on. But the upcoming guests in the next few months will include Admiral Jamie Fogo at the Center for Maritime Strategy, a great colleague and contributor. We'll hear from Captain Brian Lees, U.S. Navy retired, to discuss his important new U.S. Naval Institute book, At Sea Against the Soviet Fleet, The Evolution of U.S. Naval Intelligence in the Cold War. This is the bookend to the shelf that starts with Admiral's Advantage. It talks about operational intelligence. And finally, we'll hear from Norman Friedman in the next few sessions, the inimitable Dr. Norman Friedman, who I think his book count is up above 50 now, if I'm not mistaken. He'll correct the record when we hear from him, but he's inexhaustible. And his new book from the Naval Institute Press, Cold War Anti-Submarine Warfare. So we're really looking forward to that and others, and to your continued support and contributions and commitment to this. So that's it for today's formal session.